Welcome to A Republican Professor. I'm your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. It's Saturday, 22 August, 2026 years after Jesus. And we're continuing with our study of the presidency, getting ready for the anniversary of the finishing of the Constitution, which is coming up on September 17th, as you know, Constitution Day. We're going through the creation of the presidency, 1775 to 1789, a study in constitutional history. And we left off last time in this chapter 4 called The Presidency in the Federal Convention. And recall, we stopped at page 69 on 11 July 2026, having gone from page 61 at the top. And so we're right in the middle of this uh, Constitutional Convention chapter where early in the Constitutional Convention, summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, as you recall, they were talking about how to structure the whole daggum thing. And, well, they had to figure out how are we going to structure the executive department? Are we even going to have a separate executive department? So that is what we're talking about this summer in the 250th anniversary of the United States of America. And Thach has been a wonderful tutor in this. This is his PhD dissertation from Johns Hopkins in 1922 and made available by Liberty Fund Press in 2007. We'd like to thank Charles C. Thach Jr. for writing this. We'd like to thank Liberty Fund for making it available. Go out and get your copy today, get a physical copy, and have it in your hands as you follow along. Charles C. Thach Jr., his dates are 1894 to 1966, received his PhD from Johns Hopkins University in 1922. Specializing in political theory, he taught at the University of Minnesota and Johns Hopkins. He later became a professor of government at New York University, where he taught for over 30 years. And we're continuing. We're going to do a fair use of this, make a transformative reading of this material. Go out and get your copy today. Support brick and mortar book dealers. So we're on page 69 at the top. We have said that, what was the last sentence? The last thought was, it was only because enough of the small state governments were, as Dickinson said, friends to a good national government, that the executive department assumed its final shape. We're on the bottom of page 68. This is the last part of what we covered last time. We shall see, though, that they demanded their quid pro quo before they would dismiss their scruples, page 69 at the top. Now, here's the new material here that we're going to discuss, page 69 at the top. We have said that for adherents of monarchy in Martin's description, the term adherents of a strong executive should be substituted. It is with considerable trepidation that one doubts a conclusion of Professor Channing, who strongly intimates an opinion that where there was so much smoke about monarchy, there must have been some fire, and that the Bishop of Osnaburg rumor probably had some substantial foundation in fact. Footnote 7. I'm going to skip. I'm going to skip these footnotes. Surely, please don't call me Shirley. Surely there was no lack of monarchic talk and indeed monarchic sentiment enough to give a far better foundation for Jefferson's subsequent accusations against the Federalists than Federalist historians have ever been willing to admit. What are you trying to say, Thach? What are you trying to say? The difficulty really hinges on the definition of monarchy. Yeah. If monarchy means only an hereditary executive, as Hamilton, for example, claimed, and it is difficult to say that it means anything else, There was, we believe, no really monarchical party in the convention. As Ezra Stiles recorded in his diary on the authority of Baldwin, delegate from Georgia, it did not appear that any members in convention has the least idea of insidiously laying the foundation of a future monarchy like the European or Asiatic monarchies, either ancient or modern. End quote. But with this should be coupled Gary's or Jerry's, it's where we get the word gerrymander, his last name, Jerry's statement in the convention that if general public opinion were not to be taken into account, as Madison had argued, a limited monarchy, if regarded as desirable, should be recommended, though the genius of the people were decidedly adverse to it. Okay. Footnote 11 says, I'll do footnote 11. It may be inferred from Madison's note that Jerry thought constitutional monarchy the ideal of many members, though not necessarily his own. Fair enough. Desiring a thing abstractly and seeking to obtain it are, however, page 70 at the top, very different matters. Also, after all, the finished document had to be ratified before promulgation. This fact was a mighty weapon in breaking down even the walls of secrecy and isolation which the convention erected around itself and letting in the influence of that more general public opinion whose tenets were not those which the convention approved. The fact that the work of the convention had for its subject matter a set of resolutions introduced by Governor Randolph of Virginia, but chiefly the work of James Madison, creates a peculiar interest in the views of the latter concerning executive power on the eve of the convention. Madison has, with much justice, been called the father of the Constitution, but the claims entered for his paternity do not extend the fundamentals, do not extend to the fundamentals of Article 2. Okay. This is very good. Yes, Madison was a father of the Constitution, but the claims entered for his paternity, that is his fatherhood, do not extend to the creation of the presidency, is what Thach just said. Let's get that direct quote again. The claims entered for Madison's paternity of the Constitution do not extend to the fundamentals of Article 2, which created the presidency. The truth is that Madison's views on executive power were extremely vague when he came to Philadelphia in 1787. He realized that the Virginia Constitution had created a state of affairs that was undesirable, as is evidenced by notes which he prepared in 1784 for a speech to be delivered on the question of a general revision of that instrument. The executive department was too weak. It was dependent on the legislature for its salary and for character in the triennial expulsion. It was expensive and might be for life. Also, there was no mode of expounding Constitution and, of course, no check to General Assembly. In general, the Constitution, if so be called, defective in a union of powers, which is tyranny. Wow, I screwed that one up. In general, the Constitution, if so be called, defective in a union of powers, which is tyranny. Montesquieu. Okay, that's not my fault. That's the sentence. That's the alleged sentence. Okay. Um, so what Thach is saying is Madison didn't really have a clear understanding of executive power, at least not that was expressed. And Okay, so 2 years later, in developing his ideas concerning constitutional government for the benefit of a Kentucky friend, he, that's Madison, wrote as follows concerning the executive department. Here's a long block quote, just warning you. Quote, though it claims the second place, that is, in Madison's order of treatment, is not, in my estimation, entitled to it by its importance, all the great powers which are properly executive being transferred to the federal government. I have made up no final opinion whether the first magistrate should be chosen by the legislature or the people at large, or whether the power should be vested in one man, consisted by a council of which the president shall only be primus inter pares. There are examples of each in the U.S. and the U states, and probably advantages and disadvantages attending each. By the way, the U is capitalized in U states. It is material, I think, that the number of members should be small and that their salaries should be either unalterable by the legislature or alterable only in such manner as will not affect any individual in place. Our executive is the worst part of a bad constitution. The members of it are dependent on the legislature not only for their wages, but for their reputation, and therefore are not likely to withstand usurpations of that branch. They are, besides, too numerous and expensive, their organization vague and perplexed as to crown the and to crown the absurdity. Some of the members may, without new appointment, continue in office for life, contrary to one of the articles of the Declaration of Rights. Hmm, hmm. Now, so these, um, yeah, they're still trying to figure out whether the executive department should be unitary, because as you just saw, he thought it was should be a council, and then there's like a chairman. The president is like the chairman. And either way, they're trying to, what Madison is struggling with here in that quotation is how do you have executive independence from the crowd? Why? You're not going to get around this, guys. You're not going to get around this. There needs to be independence from the crowd. But you also want the crowd, in some sense, to have some kind of ultimate authority. And so, what does that look like, and how does that take shape? There's a real concern about the legislature being unaccountable, not just the executive, but the legislature. After all, Madison calls the legislature a vortex. His chief concern is with them in the Federalist Papers. Just read 47 to 51. Okay, let's keep going. Now, Madison was. He was, in addition, heartily in favor of the New York Council of Revision as a further security against fluctuating and undigested laws, and wrote favorably of an independent committee, oh man, whose whose function it would be to prepare bills on such subjects as seem proper to them for submission to the legislature, and also to act as a drafting bureau for the legislature when in session. Oh yeah, an independent committee. That's a good idea. Yeah, the problem with the other committees is they're dependent. And if we could only have one that was independent, all of our problems would be solved. Um, the real truth of the situation appears from these recommendations. Madison saw the defects of what existed, but he did not as clearly see the remedies. Very well said, Thach. Very well said. On the fundamental matter of method of choice, he was still undecided, and on the equally important matter of unity. Okay, so the issue is choice and unity. Choice has to do with accountability to the people, and unity has to do with how many executives there are. If it's a council, there's going to be many. It's plurality. If it's unity, it's one person. And as you can see, what Thach is doing here in this chapter on the Federal Convention discussion is they're taking everything they know from state experience and colonial experience, everything from history and tradition, and it is funneling through discussion and Socratic dialogue in the Federal Convention into a conclusion that the executive should be unity, one person. It's just easier. It's simpler. And so that's where we're headed. You're going to see that. Now, I mean, Madison is really squirrely about that, like a lot of these people are, but he eventually comes around, and this is the story of how that happened. Um, Madison saw the defects of what existed, but he did not as clearly see the remedies. On the fundamental matter of method of choice, he was still undecided on the equally important and on the equally important matter of unity. Where the makers of the New York Constitution had seen the unit executive, and I think that there's a spelling issue there, Liberty Fund. I might be wrong, but it's on page 71 in the middle, a little bit further down than the middle. You say unit executive. I think you mean unitary executive. Where the makers of the New York Constitution had seen the unitary executive, Madison saw a small number. What's the difference between a small number, which is more than one, and one? Well, the difference is profound. You either have plurality or unity. You can't have both. But Madison doesn't see that yet. He still wants a number. He wants a committee. He's like a committee guy, you know. Okay, so let's keep going. See the story here develop. This is an accurate measure of the differences between them. It is certain that Madison completely understood and approved the theory of limited government. His wholehearted acceptance of the idea of the Council of Revision in indicates an approval of the idea of independent departments. Okay, okay. As far as it goes, sure. Okay. Independent of what, though? Independent of the legislature? Independent of the judiciary? And what do you mean by that? Well, we'll continue. We'll keep going. But as yet, he did not think the matter through as consistently as had been done by others. It may be that to Madison's contemplative, unassertive mind, the executive problem was not particularly attractive. It may be, and probably is true, that his attention, we're on page 72 at the top, was engrossed in the federal aspects of the problem, for his memorandum on confederations is the evidence of such laborious effort. At any rate, whatever the reason, his ideas on the subject of executive power were no more complete in 1787 than in 1785. With that intellectual honesty, which was always characteristic of the man, he admitted the vagueness with entire candor. Thus, in a letter to Washington written as late as April 16th, 1787, he frankly states, quote, I have scarcely ventured as yet to form my own opinion either of the manner in which the executive ought to be constituted or of the authorities with which it ought to be clothed. Unquote. He still advocates a council of revision, but now including the great ministerial officers rather than a portion of the judiciary, and also national appointment of all executive officers in order to secure real national supremacy. But this is the extent of his positive suggestions. And that was a piece called Of Ancient and Modern Confederacies in, and there's no date. Thach, you got to put the date, man. Dude, put the date, the original date. Don't get me started on these footnotes. They're driving me nuts. Okay. Now, um, it should be in justice to Madison. It should, in justice to Madison, be said that the Virginia resolutions, which were submitted by Randolph to the convention, must have been considered by him entirely tentative. An analysis of their executive provisions reveals, however, that they coincide very generally with his ideas so far as they had been formulated. Complete legislative and executive separation, so far as concerns persons, was provided by a resolution prohibiting members of either branch of the legislature from holding other office, state or national, during their term of office or years thereafter. The number of the chief magistrate was undetermined. Election should be by the legislature without eligibility for re-election. You see how cagey they are about this? That is miles away from where they landed at the end of the federal convention for the Constitution on the executive, as you recall. There's no limitation on re-election in the original Constitution. That wasn't until the mid 1900s that that was brought in. And elections should be by the legislature. That's a disaster. They don't want to have anything to do with that. They created something called the Electoral College, which is not the legislature. They didn't want the legislature picking the executive because then the executive would be the creature of the legislature. They wanted something that was not a creature of the legislature. They wanted something that had independence from the legislature. And why? Well, recall what I just said. Madison calls the legislature not any other department, but the legislature of the three departments. The legislature he calls the vortex. The vortex. And again, take a look at Federalist 47 to 51, and you'll see what I'm talking about. All right, now, um, um, but you see the progression of thought. Um, the number of the chief magistrate was undetermined at this time in his mind. Election should be by the legislature at this time in his mind, without eligibility for reelection. Okay, okay. Executive salaries should be fixed. Well, that stuck. That stuck. That was a good idea. A council of revision of the New York type was provided. That didn't stick, which should possess a qualified veto. That did stick, but it wasn't in a council, it was in the unitary executive, the president. So the Council of Revision should possess a qualified veto on national legislation and a proposed legislative veto of state enactments. That was not adopted. The president has nothing to do with state vetoes, nothing to do at all. So that was dropped. The executive powers were to execute national laws. That stuck. And to enjoy the executive rights vested in Congress by the Confederation. Um, I don't like how it's said, but fine. Okay, let's continue. Page 73 at the top. What Madison considered these executive rights to be becomes more apparent from certain supplementary resolutions introduced by him on June 1st, 1787, during the convention. Remember, this is called the Presidency in the Federal Convention, Chapter 4. As a substitute for the original definition, he moved, quote, that a national executive ought to be constituted with power to carry into effect the national laws, to appoint to offices in cases not otherwise provided for, and to execute such other powers not legislative or judiciary in their nature. In their nature. as may from time to time be delegated by the national legislature. This is stuff that Helvidius brings back in the Pacificus Helvidius debates. Helvidius, well, we'll get to that later, but I'm just dropping the word Helvidius in Pacificus Helvidius debates. Um, so, um, how much do I don't want to say too much about that, but I want you to have heard Pacificus Helvidius debates because Madison's anchoring on the executive comes up in those debates, and you're going to see his biases um, on June 1st in the summer of 1787. Yeah, they're they're kind of still part of his soul later when Washington becomes president. Um, Now, considering this is Virginia's plan here, this is the Virginia plan. Considering the two sets of resolutions as a whole, we may say that the executive proposed by them was essentially subordinate to the legislature. Thach just kind of lays it out right there. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So do you have separation of powers there then? No. The fixed nature of the executive salary, the provisions for ineligibility of reelection, and the Council of Revision point unmistakably toward a desire for an independent exercise of the executive powers. Remember, the Council of Revision has the qualified veto. Remember that. So that's why he includes that in there. But legislative election and legislative determination of the major part of the executive competency negated any idea of departmental coordination. Madison seems indeed to have been thinking chiefly in terms of the existing national organization. His executive would have been a smaller committee of states strengthened by the veto power, but confined to the business of carrying out the laws. The influence of state experience is shown in the salary and Council of Revision provisions, but the primary influence was the national one. Had these provisions been incorporated into the finished Constitution, the American executive must have been of a type resembling in many fundamental ways the executive of modern Switzerland. How many of you guys are familiar with modern Switzerland politics? Well, remember he's writing this in 1922, so it would be modern would be post World War One, pre World War II, 1920-ish, 22. As soon as the executive provisions of the Virginia Plan were reached, however, a very different solution for the executive problem was offered by James Wilson of Pennsylvania. Okay, I'm interested. We've had the Virginia Plan, Madison, which is essentially an executive subordinate to the legislature. Okay. Then James Wilson comes in from Pennsylvania. A nationalist of the nationalists, he conceived the executive as a part of a governmental whole, which, deriving its powers from the general body of the nation, would supplant separatism and reduce the states to a position of practical and legal subordination to the nation. Quote, if we are to establish a national government, he said, this is James Wilson, that government ought to flow from the people at large, unquote. You see where this is going. The people will be the source of the executive authority, not the legislature, the people. Page 74 at the top. With respect to the executive, this meant negatively the elimination of the interposition of the states in its composition. Positively, it meant an executive which, resting on the support of the whole people, would maintain its independence against the legislature and so whatever the emergency, and so whatever the emergency, exercise its power without fear of interference by the temporary whims of the people or the people's representatives. The concrete provisions of Wilson's plan were well calculated to attain these ends. The chief magistracy should be possessed by one man, as giving most energy, dispatch, and responsibility. Okay, James Wilson, Pennsylvania, responding to the Virginia plan in Madison. He's saying actually the executive should be one man, no council. Why? Giving most energy, you need energy, dispatch, that is the ability to make decisions quickly, and responsibility. Energy, dispatch, responsibility. Let's take those in turn. Energy as opposed to what? Lethargy. Dragging your feet. That's what committees are known for. A vortex. Dispatch. What does that mean? What we've just said. The ability to make decisions quickly. Dispatch. You are confronted with a situation. You need to make a decision quickly and with energy. Energy helps, but quickness and energy are not exactly the same thing. Dispatch has to do with authority. You can't act with dispatch if you don't have authority to be the one calling the shots. Because if you're not the one calling the shots, you have to ask for permission. And now you're involving other people, depending on who you have to ask. If you have to ask one other person, well, then there's two people now in the decision, not one. And that other person has to hear what you're talking about and what's the reason, and there's a conversation, and then you see how it's getting dragged out. And this also, drains energy. Now, responsibility goes along with the moral issue of dispatch because if you have to make a decision quickly, and all you executives out there know exactly what I'm talking about. I've been an executive at the church for a long time, for example, and I have to make decisions quickly sometimes, and I got to have the authority to do that. If you have the authority to make a decision, then you have the responsibility, and responsibility is important as well. And how do you have responsibility if there's a group of people? Groups hide responsibility. They don't. They there's Yeah, if you know, you know. But if there's one person calling the shots on something, then they have the responsibility, and you know who to blame. You also know who to praise. But a group hides those things. People hide in groups, and some people like groups because they want to hide. They don't want to take the blame. They want to be a dirtbag, which we call that was a technical term in the Navy. It's a dirtbag. Guy that doesn't do anything, blames other people, doesn't take responsibility, doesn't know anything. Well, if you don't take responsibility, why would you take the time to learn what you need to learn? And that's what you call a dirtbag. And committees are known for having and attracting dirtbags. So it's just the nature of things. Now, also, this unity must be real, not nominal. There should be no council. This is James Wilson of Pennsylvania responding to the Virginia Plan, Madison. Federal Convention, summer 2008. Wow, summer of 1787. Oh, man, um, I'm a couple centuries off there. This unity must be real, not nominal. There should be no council, which oftener serves to cover than prevent malpractices. Oh man, I've seen that at the church. I've seen that at the church. Um, yeah. Now, that independence might be real. He proposed an absolute veto to be vested in a council of revision of the New York type. Most important of all, elections should be by the people. Now, this is very interesting because the Virginia plan kept the legislature in charge of selecting and kind of evaluating, let's see how you're doing with manager. Think of office space, like, yeah, and, the legislature has this cup of coffee. Yeah, it'd be great. Except for many people with coffee cup going, yeah, that'd be great. Um, yeah, election should be by the people. And since no responsibility was owed to them, there should be unlimited re-eligibility and relatively short term. All right, so we're getting rid of term limits, which I think is a good idea, and then a short term, relatively short term. Though that's a vague. Let's see what he means by that. He was almost unwilling, Wilson said, to declare the mode which he wished to take place, being apprehensive that it might appear chimerical. He would say, however, that at least in theory, he was for election by the people. Experience, particularly in New York and Massachusetts, shewed that all election of the first magistrate by the people at large was both convenient and successful mode. The objects of choice in such cases must be persons whose merits have general notoriety. Unquote for that. And again, and here's a longer quote. Um, let's see here. Hold on, let me check the footnote really quick. Just hmm. um, okay. I think I found a mistake. um, Now that last quotation that I read, he was almost unwilling, Wilson said. I think that Thach is quoting Madison, quoting Wilson. That's a little confusing because it sounded like he was quoting Wilson, but then that Wilson was talking about himself in the third person. That's weird. So the the um the quotation marks were not done properly, I don't think. It should be quotation marks and then quotation marks within the quotation marks, I think. He was almost unwilling, Wilson said, according to Madison, to declare the mode which he wished to take place, being apprehensive that it might appear to be chimerical. He would say, according to Madison, Wilson would say. However, this is from the notes on the Federal Convention published by Ferrand, Volume 1. Okay, just clarifying that in case you were worried about this. The source on this is Madison's notes, which were published by Ferrand, famous. Now, okay, so he was almost unwilling. This is really confusing, but this must be a mistake in the original, so we're just clarifying it. Sometimes that happens. He was almost unwilling, Wilson said, according to Madison, to declare the mode which he wished to take place, being apprehensive that it might appear chimerical. He, that is Wilson, according to James Madison, who's writing these notes, would say that, however, at least in theory, that he, that's Wilson, was for an election by the people. Experience, particularly in New York and Massachusetts, shewed that all election of the first magistrate by the people at large was both convenient and a successful mode. The objects of choice in such cases must be persons whose merits have general notoriety. Unquote from Madison talking about Wilson. And again, and here's another block quote from the same source, Madison, writing notes at the Federal Convention. Mr. Wilson renewed his declarations in favor of an appointment by the people. He wished to derive not only both branches of the legislature from the people without the intervention of the state legislatures, but the executive as well, in order the executive also in order to make them independent as possible of each other as well as of the states. Right? Unquote. Evidently, here's Thach again, page 75 at the top. Evidently, however, the force of anti-democratic sentiment was too strong, and on the ensuing day he moved for election by an electoral college chosen directly by the people. This is Wilson. As for the powers of this officer, Wilson was in accord with the general view that the British prerogative powers were not the proper model, since some were undoubtedly of legislative nature. The only powers he conceived strictly executive, he said, were those of executing the laws, okay, appointing officers not appertaining to and appointed by the legislature, though he would have extended the appointing power to include appointments to judicial office, right? There you go. Since experience showed that the impropriety of such appointments by numerous bodies, the necessary consequence of which would be intrigue, partiality, and concealment. A principal reason for unity in the executive, he added, and that's Wilson, according to Madison in Ferran, Notes on the Federal Convention. A principal reason for unity in the executive, he added, was that officers might be appointed by a single responsible person. Well, that definitely carried in. That idea definitely uh, caught on and became part of the Constitution, along with being chosen by the people, the Electoral College, the responsibility for executing laws, and appointing officers, including judicial officers. Federal judges are considered officers of the national government, appointed by the president. Just as much an officer of the government as just not executive, but officer of the government, federal government, as military officers. Just a different function, different department. Okay, now we're almost done. We're just going to get through Wilson here and we'll take a break. Now, by accepting the principle of Madison's supplementary resolutions defining executive power, which he seconded, Wilson laid himself liable to the same criticism that Madison did. What was that? But not we'll go back to that. But nevertheless, Wilson's plan went far beyond Madison's, not only on questions of detail, such as whether the executive should name judges, as Wilson believed, or the Senate, as Madison preferred, or whether the executive's veto should be absolute but general in scope. Choice by the people was the keystone of the concept. That's a good takeaway right there. If the president were to be in a position of independence, such as he desired, he must be backed by popular support. He must be the representative of the whole people, and he must have in his own hands, supported by the authority of the judiciary, a weapon for the protection of his powers, and we may believe the power of patronage further to strengthen his position. The elimination of the legislative choice and the ministerial council, with all of its potentialities, amounted to a complete revision of the Virginia Plan. So, what James Wilson is proposing here, if I may, is an executive which is has equality with the legislature by the mode of election, which is election by the people. And eligibility for reelection. Because if you impose term limits on the executive, but the executive's authority and strength comes from being the mode of election, which is the people. Hold on, hang on to this. Catch this. Don't lose this. Catch this. Term limits actually limit the people, not the executive. They limit the people because they're the ones choosing. So term limits is really a limitation on people, on the people. You might think, oh no, term limits are a limitation on the people in office. The but no. It's a limitation on the authority of the people who put them in office. That's something that is not exactly clear when people talk about term limits now. People talk about the corruption of the official that gets elected, but term limits are actually a motivated by a concern of the corruption of the people who put them there. I'm just saying. There's more to the story on term limits. We're not going to make this entirely about term limits, but that's an issue. We're going to come back to it. If accepted, the new plan would place the executive in a relation of equality to the legislature, since both would derive their powers from the same source and on the same terms, and both would be responsible alike to the voters. Wilson's appeal to the experience of New York and Massachusetts in the supporting principle of popular election and his insistence that he was not governed by the British model, which is inapplicable to the situation of this country, the extent of which was so great, and the manners so republican that nothing but a great confederated republic would do it, are scarcely necessary to indicate where he derived his ideas. He was thinking of the only strong and satisfactory Republican executive in existence, the New York governorship. So what Thach is saying here is that Wilson from Pennsylvania, in responding to Madison and the Virginia plan and the problems with that, is looking, Wilson, Pennsylvania, is looking to New York, which did it right, though at least the most right of all the states in how they structured their executive. The experiences of Massachusetts were corroborative, but the inclusion of the Council of Revision and the elimination of the Privy Council put the New York stamp unmistakably on these recommendations. Even the term which was recommended, 3 years, was that of the New York governor. The immediate result of Wilson's activities were relatively slight, being confined to the matter of unity. The issue was clear cut, Wilson declaring in advance that he intended to have no council, and the vote was decisive, 7 states to 3. New York, Delaware, Maryland furnishing the dissent. For the rest, however, the principles of the Virginia plan were retained. So at this point, unity is a huge issue as well as mode of election. For the rest, however, the principles of the Virginia plan were retained at this point in the discussion. Choice by electors was defeated by a large vote, and legislative election retained by a similar one. The term of office was set at 7 years at this point. The principle of ineligibility being retained. So long term, no eligibility for reelection. What could go wrong? Long term, and there's no incentive to do a good job because you can't be reelected. Not the best. Not the best. Maybe shorter term and then let them be reelected because then they want to do a good job. But they do have to have some kind of a stretch of a term because if they do something unpopular, which is not understood or misunderstood, you need to have that give them time to be able to make the case relatively later that they did the right thing. Because people get the wrong impression all the time if partial information is presented and there's no question and answer opportunity. All right. The chief magistrate, we're on page 77 at the top, was declared impeachable for malpractice or neglect of duty. His salary was placed beyond legislative control. The Council of Revision idea was given up, the purely executive veto being substituted. So we got the veto there. The executive duties were declared to execute the laws, that stayed, and to make appointments, that stayed. Not otherwise vested by the Constitution, the exception including judges, which were to be made despite Wilson's opposition by the upper house in accordance with Madison's motion. Um, no, no, that didn't stay. Although the involvement of the Senate did stay, if that makes sense. They just can't initiate the nomination, but they can confirm it. This abandonment of council type of executive the was of the greatest importance, according to Thach. This abandonment of the council type of executive was of the greatest importance. Every state but New York, as has been seen, possessed a separate council from which formed a part of the magistracy, that is, the executive. The council was likewise a familiar part of colonial government and was emphasized in British constitutional theory. To take the step then taken demonstrated a willingness to break with the past that is explicable only in the light of events which we have observed. The principle that the executive efficiency and executive responsibility varied in inverse proportion to the size of the executive body had been so strongly inculcated and in so many different ways that it was strong enough to force the acceptance of a new principle of executive organization. That's a really important point he just made. Again, we're interacting with the creation of the presidency 1775 to 1789, a study in constitutional history by Charles C. Thach Jr. Okay. Let me read that again. The principle that if executive efficiency goes to the idea of dispatch and executive responsibility, which has to do with duty and authority, duty and power, varied in inverse proportion to the size of the executive body and had been so strongly inculcated and in so many different ways that it was strong enough to force this exception of the new principle of executive organization. Hitherto, as Mason of Virginia lamented at the close of the convention's work, even the grand signor himself had his his divan. uh, wow. Now, also, it was true that if the convention was not ready to accept Wilson's principles of organization, they were equally unwilling to accept the opposing view of complete subordination of the executive and its complement to the unchecked legislature. Hmm. They were equally unwilling to accept the opposing view of complete subordination of the executive and its complement, the unchecked legislature. How This is something to think about. If you have concerns, you oftentimes get laser focused. So if your concern and your immediate attention span is the executive, the executive, the executive, and you're just trying to limit the executive, that's all you want to do is limit. Well, then what you end up doing possibly is this is why these discussions are so important to take place over weeks and months is you might be missing something because your lust, if I can use that word, to limit the executive, limit the executive, might end up creating an unchecked legislature, which is your tool to limit the executive. And now you have an unlimited legislature. The benefit of these guys is they had enough experience at this point with unlimited legislatures that they're like, that's not a good idea, too. And so, how do we limit the legislature? And so, they're going back and forth like a tennis ball. And then their attention goes back to the legislature. And if that's unlimited, that's not good. That's not good. Instead of energy, you have lethargy. Instead of dispatch, you have a vortex. And instead of responsibility, you have concealment of malfeasance and malpractice. What could possibly go wrong? You basically have a swamp, a lethargic swamp. And where you have a swamp, you have corruption. Most definitely, you have corruption anywhere, but especially in swamps. And if you have an unchecked legislature, you're going to have massive problems. So, how do you check the legislature? Well, go back to the executive. Then you can't have you can't have the executive be weak. He needs to have power to check the legislature, and he's got to have qualities that distinguish him from the legislature and a mode of election and choice that gives him independence from the legislature and a term of office long enough where he has independence from the people, even though that's where he's ultimately getting his authority. You see how complicated it is? You need to have an attention span and you need to go back. Thank God these guys had enough wisdom, training, and experience to know that not everything is there that meets the eye. And so this is the nature of the discussion as it's going on. The principle that executive efficiency and executive responsibility varied in inverse proportion to the size of the executive body, that is, either unitary or not unitary, has been so strongly inculcated and in so many different ways that it was strong enough to force the acceptance of a new principle of executive organization, that is, unitary. Coming from Wilson, looking to New York. Hitherto, as Mason of Virginia lamented at the close of the convention's work, even the Grand Signer himself had his divan. Now, it is also true that if the convention was not ready to accept Wilson's principles of organization, they were equally unwilling to accept the opposing view of complete subordination of the executive and its complement, the unchecked legislature. The latter concept was placed before the convention with sufficient clarity. Thus, Madison reports, quote, Mr. Sherman said he considered the executive magistracy as nothing more than an institution for carrying out the will of the legislature into effect. That is to say, legislative supremacy. That the person or persons ought to be appointed by and accountable to the legislature only, which was the depository of the supreme will of the society. They were the best judges of the business which ought to be done. They were the best judges of the business which ought to be done by the executive department. So this is called legislative supremacy. It's parliamentary. And consequently, continuing the quote from Madison and the records of the Federal Convention, talking about Sherman, The number necessary from time to time for doing it, he wished the number might not be fixed, but that the legislature should be at liberty to appoint one or more as experience might dictate, unquote. He likewise contended that the national legislature should have power to remove the executive at pleasure. Bedford went even further and was opposed to every check on the legislative. Oh, man. Even the Council of Revision first proposed. He thought it would be sufficient to mark out in the Constitution the boundaries to the legislative authority, which would give all the requisite security to the rights of the other departments. The representatives of the people were the best judges of what was for their interest and ought to be under no external control whatsoever. So this is just legislative supremacy from Sherman and Bedford. Here's Thach. The victory of the the victory of the unit executive, meaning unitary executive, and qualified veto principle was thus an express repudiation of the principle of subordination in its extreme form. What Thach just said there is unitary executive, qualified veto was an express repudiation of the principles of legislative supremacy. The status of the definition of executive powers and of the mode of election at the conclusion of the committee of the whole stage left the executive weak and dependent. But it was a real gain for the strong executives to secure a decisive defeat of the opposing principle. All right. So we have, at this point in the convention, unitary executive, qualified veto, rejection of legislative supremacy, but because the status on the definition of executive powers and the mode of election at the conclusion of the committee of the whole stage left the executive weak and dependent. Still too weak, still too dependent. However, even that was a real gain for strong executives, those proponents, to secure a decisive defeat of the opposing principle. Now, we're going to stop there. We've been going for about an hour. Thanks for joining me on the Republican Professor podcast. I've been your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. Today is Saturday, 22 August, 2026, years after Jesus. Okay. And I've enjoyed this time with you. We went from page 69 at the top to page 78 in the middle. And we'll pick up there next time. We're in the chapter on the presidency in the Federal Convention, chapter 4. And we're having a wonderful time. We're making good time because I'd like to get this done before the 17th of September. Give you plenty of stuff to talk and think about. Okay. All right. Well, I hope you guys are having a good Saturday. By the time you listen to this, most likely it's already done. And I'm going to go about my business. I might have a cigar. And we'll talk to you guys soon. Take good care. God bless.